Okay, I think just so we can get the afternoon session rolling, we'll go ahead and get started. This will be a little bit out of order from what you'll see on the program, but just so we can make sure we get talks in before the break, we'll go ahead and get rolling here with Dr. Kate Dion. Dr. Kate received her DVM from Iowa State University in 2011. After graduating, she joined the Hanor Company as a veterinarian and animal well-being quality assurance manager. Her responsibilities include health management, overseeing the Hanor Animal Well-Being and Quality Assurance Program, Hanor Diagnostic Lab, and the Hanor Health Research Program. She completed the Executive Veterinary Program in Swine Health Management at the University of Illinois in 2016 and is currently pursuing a PhD in Population Sciences in Animal Health at Iowa State University College of Veterinary Medicine. So Kate, thank you for being here today, and the floor is yours.
All right, guys, we are not going to be talking about foreign animal diseases right now, so this makes me feel a little bit better after Chris had asked me to talk, and I probably dragged my feet and begrudgingly said yes and didn't really know where he was going to put me at in the program, and then it comes out I'm in the FAD session, and I'm a little confused here because I work on biosecurity with domestic diseases, but I think it's all correlated, so maybe I can tie some of this together. So we're going to talk a little bit today about wean to market biosecurity, a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing trying to understand when and why pigs that start off negative for certain viral diseases that we see go positive, and hopefully can eventually provide some aspects on why that is. All right. Just do this for now. Okay. So, first and foremost, when we're thinking about the wean to market phase of production, we're trying to raise a pig to market, right? So, we can live with diseases, but at the end of the day, we really should start to focus and worry a little bit more about lateral introductions of diseases and trying to prevent them, because there's a lot of reasons why it would be better for us because we're missing some opportunity there. And kind of the big one we think about, right, is that we need to protect our sow farms. We've invested a lot of money in the facilities and those animals, and we definitely can drag diseases back, and the more diseases that we have prevalent in our wean-to-market population causes risk for our sow farms. And so the SDRS data, actually, the last 2 years has shown that the increase of sow farm PRRS positives on the diagnostics across the United States is actually preceded by more positives in the growing pig population. And so I think we could probably say, is this a chicken or an egg thing? But in likelihood, it's probably that, we're spreading it in those populations and putting those farms at risk that are either in similar areas or tracking it back. And one of the other things I think about is just really preparedness for FAD, and I'm sure that's why Chris slotted me in this session, right? Anything that we do to try and limit the movement of diseases that we are currently dealing with is only going to help us prepare to be prepared for the extreme biosecurity that we're going to have in place if we would ever have an FAD event in the United States. And it's just one of those things that it's not going to happen overnight, that we're just going to be great at biosecurity when we haven't always been focused on it in the wean to market phase. It just takes time to get there. So anything we do today can help us be prepared, and hopefully we never have to be prepared for that FAD event. But really, for those of us in this phase of production, we're trying to make money on selling a market hog, right? And so we've lost some opportunity by allowing pigs to get lateral pathogen introductions. And so if we go back and look at the study on the economics of the cost of PRRS in the United States, if we dig into that update that was done in 2013 by Dr. Holtkamp, if you go into the section that talks about the actual growing pig phase of production, that study showed that there was a $2.29 per head cost, and that was due to increased mortality and slower growth of those pigs, and those were pigs that actually started off negative and became positive. And so, 9 years since that study has been completed, we can all think about what $2.29 would be in today's dollars, and so already just one disease that's, obviously very costly for us, even in the wean to market phase of production. On the other end of the spectrum, another one of the viral diseases that are readily spread are coronaviruses, so porcine epidemic diarrhea virus and Delta coronavirus. And so Dr. Weedle in 2020 had presented that in the system that she worked for, if 23% of the growing pigs sites became positive, in 14 months that would cause their system a loss of 1.6 million to that system. That's a huge dollar amount just for even less than a quarter of those pigs become affected. And then the last one I have up there is when you start to get combinations of these viruses. And actually, a study that I worked with on a student for the pigs in the production system that I work for, we looked at combinations of those. And for pigs that start off negative, for both PRRS and coronaviruses from the sow farm, if they became positive for both of those diseases during the growing phase, and it didn't matter whether it was, PRRS first or coronaviruses first, that was a $7.08 cost per pig if they had both of those diseases. So very costly, right? A lot of opportunity we could get back if we could limit some of these introductions. But we have a lot of challenges, as I'm sure all of you that work in these areas know, about how we choose to raise our weaned market pigs in the United States. So we often raise them in high dense locations. That allows us to be closer to the feedstuffs that we need as well as our markets. But that means we've got a lot of pigs on top of each other that start off with different disease statuses and things that can be really connected. So transferring diseases may occur more readily. The other thing that we utilize with trying to get to a low cost of production is we've made an infrastructure that is really reliant upon contracts, which is great, right? We can spread out that cost of production, allow more people to be involved, but that means that generally a lot of our inputs and facilities are contracted out. And that might be the facilities, the labor, the feed, maintenance, transportation, and even handling manure. And then maybe further from there, those contractors may subcontract out some of that labor. Like maybe they don't want to have to do the market pig load out, so they're going to hire a crew in, or the same with vaccination or power washing services. And so ultimately what really happens is that we end up with a lot of our farms that, although they may not be with the same producer or the same production system, they're very tied together because so much contract labor and facilities is occurring. And so ultimately that really creates a lot more challenges, right? The further you are away from actually being in charge of that, the less control you're going to have over what's actually occurring on who's in your barn, when they're in your barn, and where they've been before they've been in your barn. And so just, what work has been done in the field prior to this, a couple recent studies that have been done in swine dense areas in the United States. Both had at least portions of the study done in the upper Midwest. That first study in 2019 had 63 weaned market farms in it, and 44% of them had a wild type PRRS detection. And of those, 44% of those farms that got that, they found 18 distinct viruses. So, a pretty high rate of PRRS introductions as well as lots of different viruses there. And then a more recent study done in 2021, they had 81 groups of pigs in that study, and 91% of those farms actually had a wild type 2 PRRS detection in them. So almost every group in that study had an introduction. So now that I've told you that there's some precedents that we see, at least in the field, through some studies that have been done, a lot of introductions, I'm going to give you a little bit of an update on what I have been lovingly referring to as my growing pig biosecurity study. Still much in progress working with the data, so some of this is still preliminary, but we'll give you an update. So just for the background, I have 75 groups of pigs that started off as negative for PRRS, PD, Delta coronavirus, and TG at placement from the sow farm. We did not vaccinate anybody for PRRS, so that was not a complicating factor in our diagnostics. All of these pigs are raised in northwest Iowa, so obviously a very pig-dense area. And then we collected oral fluids on them every 2 weeks to understand if they had become positive for any of those pathogens. And on the every 2 week basis, I've been collecting the biosecurity characteristics of the farm, as well as all of the events that I could think of and track down that occurred. So I'll go over the good news, right? We did not detect any TG in any of these farms, which really matches the current information from the SDRS program that we really haven't been having TG diagnosed, so it's just good to confirm that what we were seeing, doing a lot of frequent testing, that we did not pick that up. But then when we start to look at the other coronaviruses, 11 of the groups became positive for PED. And so I've got up there that 71 groups were included in that because 4 of the groups had a positive test on their first test, so they were excluded. And then when we look at Delta coronavirus, 19 of the groups became positive for that pathogen. Again, 72 groups started in the study there because 3 had their first sample come back as positive. And then we get to the big bad one, PRRS. We had 73 out of 75 groups become positive, so almost every group of pigs in this study became positive for PRRS, and so that was very similar to that prior study, again, that I said was part of that study was in the upper Midwest as well. So what this really means for us is we have a lot of lateral disease transmission occurring, and so while that can be really frustrating for me as a veterinarian, wishing that we weren't having all of our pigs having a lateral introduction of PRRS, and what are we going to do about that? But what I really think is what that really means is we have to flip that on its head. It means we have a lot of opportunity, a lot of places that we can improve, and then hopefully we can eventually figure out how we could reduce these introductions and recoup some of that cost that occurs to our producers when they get a lateral infection. So just going into the diagnostics a little bit more, what does it look like for when are these pigs getting PED? So PED had, a pretty distinctive pattern here where most of the introductions occurred early in the nursery phase, and then I had a couple introductions that occurred during the late finishing phase. And then Delta coronavirus detection was very similar, where the majority of the introductions occurred during the nursery phase, and then had a few introductions during the late finisher phase. And then PRRS looked quite a bit different here. So the good news is it didn't have quite those early introductions in the nursery, but as you can see, you start to think most of these pigs in this study after that 9-week age sample are going to move to the finisher. There was a lot of early finisher introductions, and that kind of trailed out towards the end, but again, most of them occurred in that early phase, so that might help us try to understand what's going on event-wise during these pigs' lifetime to understand why are we getting lateral introductions at that time point. So I want to just share a few things that I've been working on trying to understand why that might be. And so one of the characteristics that has been interesting for why these pigs might be going positive is the larger farms in the study were more likely to become positive for all 3 diseases compared to the what I would call the smaller herd size in this study. And I didn't think this was surprising at all. There's actually quite a few studies on the south side of things that would have the same information, that the larger the herd size, the more frequently they became positive for PRRS. I don't think that's been looked at quite as hard for the coronaviruses yet, but for sure there's been quite a few studies that show that for PRRS. And it may be just that we have a larger susceptible population of animals, but likely, as you can imagine, with a larger herd size, there's just more events that are going to have to happen, right? We have to get more feed in. We have to have more loads of animals in, more loads of animals out. We have to probably have a little bit more labor, potentially, to run those facilities. We have to have more supplies. We have to enter supplies more frequently. So there's just probably going to be a trend towards more events occurring on a larger herd size that may make it more susceptible for a disease introduction. So then I'm going to preface this by these charts are a little busy. So the next set we're going to go through is actual events. And so I picked out some event categories that I've been working on. And what we're looking at here is just the events that occurred at a more frequent basis for the pathogen positive groups compared to the pathogen negative groups. So I'm going to start with a nursery. And so over on the left-hand side there are categories that we looked at that I selected for today, our wean pig, that should be, wean pig arrivals, feed deliveries, propane and fuel deliveries, caretaker visits, new supply entries, transferred supplies, maintenance inside the facility, maintenance on the outside of the facility, and then anybody else that may come to the farm. So kind of lumped into that management type of visitor, a veterinarian, or just a straight visitor. And so for the groups that became positive for PED, they had more of these events occur during the nursery phase, so the entire phase. So that was wean pigs, feed deliveries, propane and fuel, caretaker visits, new supply entries, and the maintenance on the outside of the farm. So then if we compare that for the farms that became positive for Delta coronavirus, they actually had all of the categories higher for the events that occurred. So again, wean pig arrivals, feed deliveries, propane and fuel, caretaker visits, new supply entries, transferred supplies, maintenance inside, maintenance outside, management, veterinarians, and visitors. And so it's a little bit interesting to me, I think, just because since those are both coronaviruses, they're very similar in how they can be transmitted, but yet we have some differences, at least amongst this group of farms that was in the study, on the events that occurred more frequently. And then PRRS had less events that were more frequent in the groups that became positive, and so that was just new supply entries and maintenance on the inside of the farm. So again, this was just during the nursery phase for the farms that became positive for those pathogens during the nursery phase. And just want to point out that we should be careful on interpreting this at this point because this is just the sum of the events that occurred during the entire turn. So I haven't worked on the timing portion of this yet, so if the pigs become positive very early and we haven't had a fuel delivery, we probably cannot blame the fuel delivery for the outbreak of that disease. So again, just reminder that these are a summary, but still interesting that we're already seeing some differences amongst the entire turn for this. So then I'm going to switch over to the finisher, and we've added a couple more events to these. So they, again, in the study were from nurseries to finishers. So they had a feeder pig arrival, they had market pig removal, they had cull pig removals, and then the other additional one that came into play for the finishers was rendering as well, potentially. And so for PED, the sites that became positive for PED had higher numbers of feeder pig arrivals, market pig removals, feed deliveries, propane and fuel deliveries, caretaker visits, maintenance outside the farm, and again, those visitors to the farm. And again, we see a little bit of difference when we look at the Delta coronavirus, the same with the feeder pigs and the market pig removals, the feed deliveries, the propane and fuel, caretaker visits, and new supply entries. But then when you look at PRRS, they had quite a bit more things where the positive farms did compared to the negative farms there with almost all those categories. But I think we have to be careful on interpreting that one because we only had 2 negative farms in this study. So it may just be just due to the disparity in the positives versus negatives that we saw in this group of pigs. So one of the events that I had put up there was about the role of the caretaker. And so we can understand, a lot of studies out there on some of those other events, but how does people movements actually play a role in movement of diseases? There's been very early work with PRRS that if you just wash your hands and change your boots and your clothing, that's good enough to prevent moving PRRS into pigs if you're contaminated. But yet we see a lot of introductions, and we tend to have, in the wean to market phase, a lot of folks that may chore more than one barn, management, veterinarians, visitors, we go farm to farm. And that's quite a bit different than probably most of our sow farms where, you're generally probably only visiting a sow farm a day or something if you were going to do more than one exact same disease status. But it seems to be a fair bit more common to go site to site, in the wean to market phase, and maybe even without any prior knowledge of the disease status of those pigs. Myself as a veterinarian, it seems like it's a badge of honor, right? When you're like, I've been to 6 or I've been to 8 farms in a day because you think you got a lot done. But maybe we need to kind of flip the script on that, and maybe we shouldn't be tracking across so many farms. Or, what is the role of the actual farm staff taking care of the animals, you know, even if they are thinking about going in the right order for the age of the pig or the disease status of the pig like we teach them, they may not be able to, because some of the events that they have in a day, like a load in or a load out of animals, is scheduled at a very specific time, and that may alter the times that they're able to do chores at barn 1 versus chores at barn 2 and chores at barn 3, even though they have, you know, disease status X at this one that's not the same at this one. So some of it is, you know, they're kind of at the mercy of how we've scheduled, you know, their day based on the various events that occur. And so just getting started into this side of things, but the objective of this study was really to understand if the movement of the caretakers from one premise to another impacted the spread of the 4 diseases we've been talking about during the nursery phase of production. And so the reason why I chose to focus on this is because a subset of the farms in those 75 groups during the nursery phase were chored by employees. And so those employees use a program called Timesheet Mobile to clock in and clock out. You know, it's just a, you know, app that they can utilize. You pay a service to use it, but it's geofenced to a farm location, so you can see where people are at and how long they've been there. And so what that did was allow us the opportunity to see what other farms they've been at and what order they visited them in. And so we went back and we looked at 72 hours prior to the time that they entered that farm to see where they were at and understand their site visit order for the farm caretakers on these farms. And so then utilizing the information that I have available to me using diagnostics in our system and our sow farm diagnostics, I assigned all of the sites that they visited a disease status for the groups or for the sites of pigs that they visited prior to coming to this farm. And so then that allowed us to summarize the number of positive versus negative sites that they visited for each disease. So again, we're going to look at the 3 days before they enter that farm every time they enter that farm. So if on day 1 they're there, I'm going back 3 days. If on day 2, I'm going 3 days before that, and we're summarizing all of these up. How many negative farms did they visit? How many positive farms did they visit for each of those? And I standardized that to a 14-day time periods to make everything even, right? If I had a 16-day time period and a 12-day time period here, we needed to equalize that so we didn't get skewed. And so then I calculated the ratio of the number of visits from positive farms over the total number of visits there. And then we analyzed that using a logistic regression in R. And so just to step back, again, there were 63 groups that were eligible for this portion of the study that had, during the nursery phase, an employee taking care of the site. So again, there were no TGE detections. 8 of those nurseries became positive for PED, 12 for Delta coronavirus, and 6 for PRRS. So had a pretty good number there that we could work with for positive versus negative. So this next slide is a little complicated. But again, remember that we summarized for the entire nursery turn how many positive versus negative sites for each of those diseases that they visited. So across the top is the disease status of the nursery, and the first line is how many negative sites that they would have visited during that turn, and the second line is the positive sites that they would have visited during that term for each of those farms' disease status. And so then across the bottom there is the ratio. And so you can see across the turn, during a nursery turn, the caretakers were getting to quite a lot of other sites because, you know, in this, the way they're set up for labor is, you know, each employee is, you know, there's a designated number of spaces that they're supposed to be running, but they work together in pods. So some days you may need 2 people to go to that site to get the vaccination done. Well, if each of them visited 3 or 4 farms the day before, and 3 or 4 farms the day before, and 3 or 4 farms the day before, you can see how these number of visits really start to add up over time, even when you're only looking at maybe a 7-week period. But ultimately, what we saw there was that none of the ratios of the number of visits from positive over the total number of visits was significant in our logistic regression for any pathogen. And so ultimately, Kate stopped talking stats. What does that mean, right? What it means is that this may suggest that more frequent caretaker visits or visiting a higher ratio of positive sites is not associated with the introduction of virus into these pigs that were previously negative. But what I want to point out is I've just started with this. We took a swag. Let's look at 3 days, right? Well, okay, so 3 days, it wasn't important. Well, maybe that's far enough out that what you did three days ago isn't impacting what you're doing today on your visit. So I still need to look at 2 days before and 1 day before. So hopefully eventually I'll have that information for you. And the other thing, positive side of me hopes that maybe our risk was mitigated because maybe during those, nursery turns, maybe we were following the entry procedures and they were working, right? So a lot of possibilities there. Still more work to come on that is what I would say there. And so, interesting concept, especially, we look at pig movements and all these other things. So how we really looked at people movements, right? So hopefully more to come there. We'll keep everyone updated. So then, the other part of me, I work within a production system every day. And so one of my main jobs is to impact biosecurity, right? Especially in the wean to market phase of production that I work in. So how do we do that, right? This seems to be something we haven't emphasized as much. And so it may be new or novel. And so I was just kind of thinking about, how do we build a program? How do we get this going? And so one of the areas that I also dabble in, enjoy, is animal well-being. And I had stole this slide from Sherry Webb when she was at the National Pork Board a few years ago, and she was giving a presentation about building a culture of good animal well-being and food safety on farm. And I really appreciated the process that they had put together in this diagram. And really it starts with having the correct people, right? So getting the right people hired, getting them orientation so that they understand what they're supposed to be doing day to day, and then really focusing on training, right? And then ultimately, the following steps feed back to those, right? So we have to manage our people well and set our expectations so they understand what they're supposed to do. And then we need to provide them feedback, whether that's through internal assessment or maybe even external. And so really, still, it's the same procedure, I think, for building a culture of good biosecurity. So we need to have a good structured process, and it involves all of these phases of the pillars here. So I think we could just cross out animal well-being and put biosecurity in here and say this is what we need to focus on as we start these programs. And so, I don't have time to tell you all about all of the things I work on a day-to-day basis, but, I think I would just say that it really does take time to build a good culture, especially in the wean to market phase where we maybe haven't emphasized it as much or worked on it as hard. It may just be a new concept to our producers. I've spent a lot of time working in the south side of things, so, when I came to work in my current position, that was every day, right? You're going to take a shower, you're going to follow these clean, dirty lines, and that's going to be expected. And then, my team that I work with in the wean to market side, most of them have really just been in the wean to market side for their entire careers because they're based in Iowa and haven't really spent so much time on the south side of things. So they really had never learned a lot of that stuff. So even just something like when we started building sites that had showers on them, you think it would be obvious, right? Which side of the shower we're going to put the towels and the clothing on to make sure that that's on the clean side. And I would walk in and I would find all that on the dirty side. And it wasn't that they were doing it on purpose. They just hadn't been taught the right procedures. And so some of this, we just got to start at the ground level to work with people that maybe haven't been taught this. And so there's a lot of training, and there's explaining, and there's retraining that have to occur. Because most people, even when they are trying to do well, may not pick this up on the first time. We often have to be told more than once to get things done correctly. And so on the same lines of things, we have to set those expectations. What do we expect to do? And we have to expect that we're going to have to repeat that, and that's okay. And, that's not just at the farm caretaker level, that's anyone that's in our barns. And that's probably, especially in a contract situation, we've allowed a lot of people into our facilities that maybe we didn't set those expectations before. The door is unlocked, it's the feed motor in barn 1 that needs repaired. And, we just have the hope that the guy gets in there and gets it repaired because our pigs need feed and we've got to go do something else. We weren't there to meet him there and explain to him how he wanted to enter our farm. So it goes to all levels, not just the people doing the chores at the site. The other thing is we don't want to let non-compliances go unaddressed. It's really easy to just say, I got other things I'm worried about today, don't focus on this stuff. But if you let it slide, it's going to continue to happen, right? So we have to continue to follow up. Again, this repetition, builds the expectation, gets the opportunity there that it has to be done the way you expect it. One of my things that I used to get entertainment out of is, we would ask that our feed truck drivers put on shoe covers when they are on the ground on our farms. And that was a hardship initially, right? But if I would go to a farm and see them, it's easy to either ignore it or just go up right there and yell at them. And so that's not really hard for some people. So I just grab a package of shoe covers out of my truck and walk over to them and go, you must have forgot these today. And they immediately are all like, oh, yeah, I know I'm supposed to have them and give you some excuse. But the more we have people doing those type of things, it's setting that expectation that we expect that and we're not going to call them out if they're not getting it done correctly. The other thing is use stories, past experience to emphasize importance. I'm sure a lot of us have dealt with like a lateral break of 1,4,4,1C PRRS in the last couple of years, and it's probably not been a pleasant experience, right? And so we can tell our people about how it was not fun to deal with, and so we can use those experiences to show them why biosecurity is important. And again, feedback is important. Tell people if they're doing it well. Tell people if they're not doing it well and how they can improve. I think the biggest thing is that we've just got to get started somewhere. And so I put up that picture of the secure pork supply map. And so I think that there's just some simple things we can start, right? We don't have to go out and do all the facility improvements, but maybe if we're using something like rendering, we want to make sure that we address that the boots that we're wearing in the barn don't go out to the rendering box, so that we may not drag the stuff into the barn that might have come from the rendering truck. And so I think a lot of other people are probably in the APP talk right now, and this isn't the first time we've seen this disease in Iowa that's been tracked back to rendering. So if you dig back a few years into the MSHMP science pages, there was a prior case report of that in Northwest Iowa, and those farms from different systems were connected to rendering. And this past season, and still ongoing, is one of the main things that connects those farms is to rendering. So think of the big picture things to start on, to focus on Wean to Market. And the thing I would say is just small progress is still progress. We don't have to fix it all overnight, and it's probably going to be really difficult to go out and just throw everything at our caretakers, and we would overwhelm them. So focus on big picture things, a few things we can work on this month, set a deadline. Now we're going to go work on these things. We're going to do this training now. So again, I remind myself every day when I'm a little frustrated that maybe we're not there yet, that we're still making progress. Even when I talk to people and they can at least tell me what the answer of what they should be doing, even if they're not doing it, it's still better than I was 5 years ago, right? Where we didn't have any sort of clue that that was a way we could transmit diseases. So again, if you're frustrated, just remind yourself, small progress is still progress. And then again, I just have to tell myself, and I leave you guys with the funny chicken picture, is that I always talk about biosecurity. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. We're not going to get through this race real quickly. It's not going to end. We're going to have to keep going and trying to, maintain and improve biosecurity for the rest of time, right? I didn't expect that in 2013, not even 2 years after I'd graduated vet school, that I'd be dealing with a disease that when I searched my notes from vet school, I had one line about PED. And I've seen other pathogens that are new and novel to us too. So I think that we just have to continue to prepare as much as we can. And again, just get started. It's a marathon, not a sprint, but any progress is still some progress. So overall, I do have to thank SCHC for funding on the current biosecurity study that I have been working on. So very much thanks to them and their support. And I don't know how we're doing schedule-wise, if you want me to do questions now or what you want to do.
We probably have time for maybe a quick question, otherwise will you be around?
Yes.
Break?
Yeah, I'll be around at the break.
Anything quick?
Hey, on your PED and your Delta Corona, it looked like those cases were kind of early.
Mm-hmm.
Within 2 weeks. What about transportation, sanitation, or just even the sanitation in the barn?
Yeah, so Tyler asked about the sanitation related to transport and the facilities, correct? Yeah, so actually all of the wean pigs would have been loaded onto a trailer that had been washed, disinfected, and baked. The tractor, like many others, is always in question because some of those are contract, some of those are owned. And then, so, trailer itself, you would hope you've taken it out, but obviously those pigs are on the road. Is there potential for contamination somewhere else? Who knows? And then as far as facilities, again, all of those facilities would have been through a wash and disinfection process. Execution on that wasn't necessarily evaluated. I do have, still working on that information, but prior disease status. So, is it a possibility that it was from the prior turn of pigs? Sure could be. They did have any of the groups that their first test was positive, we excluded, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't some deep, dark corner of the barn that you didn't get clean or pulled out some equipment maybe from the prior turn that got missed. And, the other point of that, too, is probably just, if your turn prior to that had the coronavirus, the surrounding area may be contaminated, right? So if even if you've got an incinerator, you got to go out to your incinerator to dispose of your mortalities. Well, how many of us are out washing the handle and disinfecting the handle of our incinerator turn to turn? Because we think it's outside, right? That it's probably either infected or we're naive and think that the rain washed it away. So there's definitely some possibilities there too. And then, maybe some age susceptibility too of the animals might be explanation for that. So more to come.